At HDFC Securities Institutional Research, we were looking forward to the budget with a number of hopes and aspirations, which were driven by the fact that when Mr. Chidambaram took over the finance ministry some 7 months ago, ever since that happened, there were steps taken which led to these hopes being inflated. Unfortunately, what happened was that the budget was largely uninspiring and made token attempts to make small changes here and there. And while there was a lot of targeting of welfare, there wasn't much by way of concessions given or new thrusts or policies which would encourage businessmen to invest. And that, I think, is the big letdown in the budget this year. So, for example, what we were looking for was clear reform momentum on 4 or 5 counts. The typical bottlenecks in the economy, such as coal production, or improving the investment climate, or introducing large-scale power reforms, or finding a solution to the SEB loss imbroglio. We were looking forward to getting direction on fresh infrastructure creation or on oil and gas. But in all these sectors, there were some noises made. There was a little bit of a tweak here and a move there, but no large-scale change which could inspire businessmen to begin to invest in a large way. So to that extent, it was completely disappointing. It's not that there was nothing in the budget which would matter for the economy, but the big moves were missing. Despite this letdown, I suppose it's a time to go back to hopes and dreams and aspirations and hope that the small moves will at least work out in favor of investors. So, for example, there are several tax breaks given to individuals, whether it's in terms of small changes in the income tax slabs or incentives given for interest paid on housing loans and so on. So maybe on the margin, housing finance companies would gain, or cement companies would gain, especially given the current strong demand situation for cement in at least the northern and western parts of the country. Then again, the PPPs announced for the coal mining sector are likely to induce several private players to invest in this sector, or mining equipment manufacturers to gain from this. The secular sectors such as FMCG or pharma or IT were left largely untouched, and I don't think there will be a substantial break in the momentum for these sectors. As a matter of fact, if the rupee were to weaken from here, the IT sector would be a major gainer. And despite the higher imposition of excise on cigarettes, we think companies like ITC enjoy very strong pricing power, so I don't think there's going to be a big difference there. On the other hand, even small things like extending the JNNURM for the purchase of 10,000 new buses and so on will help CV manufacturers at the margin, though they are in very bad shape otherwise. The GST rollout, again, there was no clarity on the timeline, but if the momentum is carried forward and if we are able to roll it out in another year or so, that would definitely help increase the tax to GDP ratio. All in all, I think the budget carries forward incremental changes and incremental improvements, especially on the fiscal consolidation front, but there is nothing that changes things completely for business, and there is nothing inspiring in the budget. So to that extent, it's disappointing. I think it's a time to go back to living on hopes and aspirations. I have a concern on taxation. There was a mention about taxability of profits made by foreign investors in this country. And how the tax exemptions currently available to them if these investments are routed through tax havens may be up for scrutiny. Now, we'll have to see the fine print a little more carefully on that, but I'm sure a lot of FIIs are already delving into the fine print and are worried about whether some of their tax-free profits are now up for imposition of tax. So that is one worry I have. So another worry I have on taxation is the possible increase of tax incidence on banks who take write-offs on NPAs. Once more, this is something where the fine print has to be seen very carefully, and the fact that it applies differently to different banks will have to be considered. But some benefits of taking write-offs on NPAs will perhaps not be available to banks in future. So to that extent, tax imposition might rise on them. So given all these worries on the macro front and a lack of clear direction, especially when it was awaited, I think the way to invest in these markets, especially for institutional investors, is that we should go back to the drawing board and look for bottom-up stock picking and look at quality of managements, look at intrinsic quality of the businesses rather than try to identify top-down themes. And that is perhaps the only way to invest sensibly in this market.